Welcome to Shadow Archive. This channel explores hidden power, elite networks, buried scandals, and the darker systems operating behind public reality. If you're drawn to secrets, influence, and uncomfortable truths, you're in the right place. Tonight we begin with a film many dismissed, and a pattern that may have been hiding in plain sight. What if Eyes Wide Shut was never just fiction? What if the most disturbing part of the film wasn't the ritual, but the structure behind it? And what if years later real-world documents made that structure harder to ignore? This is not just a film analysis. Not really. What you are about to hear is a reconstruction built from a movie, a release history, and a set of real-world documents that arrived years later. Separately, they are unsettling. Taken together, they begin to look like something else entirely. In January 1999, Stanley Kubrick completed Eyes Wide Shut after an unusually long production and years of preparation. He screened it privately for studio executives, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. 6 days later, he was dead. The official cause was cardiac arrest. Beyond that, questions have lingered. Those questions do not prove anything by themselves. People die unexpectedly. Studios alter films. Public memory moves on. What makes this case unusual is the sequence. Private screening, sudden death, immediate post-production changes, and then decades of near-total silence from the people who saw the director's final cut. The original script treats that sequence as a confession hidden in plain sight. This version keeps the structure but narrows the claim. We are not saying Kubrick exposed a secret with certainty. We are examining why the final film, its missing material, and later public records appear to echo one another so closely. The first anomaly is not the ritual itself. It is the handling of the completed film. Warner Brothers did not preserve the cut exactly as screened. Visible digital figures were added to obscure portions of the masked sequence, officially to avoid an NC-17 rating and protect theatrical distribution. That explanation may be true as far as it goes, but some people involved in the production later suggested the removed material was not merely more explicit. They described it as more specific, more recognizable, less like fantasy and more like observation. That difference is where the unease begins. Nicole Kidman's scattered remarks only deepen that unease. She spoke of the experience as profoundly important, but difficult to explain. That does not confirm any hidden narrative. Still, it fits the pattern of a project that affected those involved in ways they later struggled or declined to describe publicly. Then there is the location. The mansion used for the ritual was not an invented backlot structure. Kubrick chose Mentmore Towers, a real estate built for the Rothschild family in the 19th century. A house designed to embody dynastic wealth, a rival, and a highly visible form of elite power. That choice matters because Kubrick rarely chose anything casually. He was known for exhausting precision, especially when architecture carried narrative weight. If he wanted a fictional palace of privilege, he could have built one. Instead, he filmed in a house already tied to the visual language of concentrated private influence. The original script pushes this further by comparing Mentmore to later photographs of elite costume events, especially the 1972 Rothschild Surrealist Ball in France. The masks The theatrical animal imagery, the atmosphere of protected excess, none of this proves continuity, but the visual resemblance is difficult to ignore. From there, the script turns to structure, not just what the ritual looks like, but how elite space works. Controlled entry, isolated location, restricted movement, layers of access. In that reading, the mansion is less a Gothic backdrop than an operating environment, a place built to separate insiders from witnesses. The comparison to Jeffrey Epstein's properties enters here, and this is where careful language matters. The documented facts concern trafficking, recruitment, isolation, secrecy, and protection. Claims beyond that remain contested, but the resemblance in architecture of control, private transport, controlled interiors, selective access is part of the argument. Little St. James, the New Mexico Ranch, the Manhattan Townhouse, in court filings and reporting, these locations were described not as random addresses, but as environments shaped around privacy and asymmetry. The social surface appeared legitimate. What was hidden, according to prosecutors and victims, depended on that surface remaining intact. That distinction between surface and inner chamber is central to Eyes Wide Shut. Bill enters one world with a password, but not the deeper one. He sees enough to be shaken, not enough to understand fully. In the original script, that becomes a model for how protected systems preserve innocence around the edges. The password itself, Fidelio, is treated as another deliberate signal. In Beethoven's opera, a false identity is used to enter a closed institution and expose concealed wrongdoing. Kubrick's use of that title may not solve the film, but it does suggest that infiltration and incomplete witness were on his mind from the start. The ritual sequence adds another layer, the score. Masked Ball gives way to reversed liturgical sound designed under Kubrick's direction. Some viewers hear atmosphere, others hear inversion. The original script connects this to ceremonial tradition, arguing that Kubrick was signaling specificity rather than mood. That remains an interpretation, but not a baseless one, more cautiously framed. The point is this: Kubrick often used sound as argument, not decoration. If he requested reversed sacred music for the film's central secret gathering, then the effect was likely intentional in more than a purely aesthetic sense. He wanted the scene to feel wrong at the level of structure. And that brings us to the real hinge of the story. Not the orgy, not the masks, not even Ziegler's explanation. The original script argues that the film's final shot in the toy store is the true ending, because the background action suggests the system has not ended at all. In that final scene, while Bill and Alice speak in the foreground, Helena drifts toward two older men in the background and exits the frame. The moment is easy to miss. The camera does not underline it. No score announces it. That restraint is exactly what makes it unsettling. The original script reads that movement as the film's most important disclosure. This version keeps the implication, but with caution. We cannot know with certainty what Kubrick intended beyond the image itself. What we can say is that the staging is too deliberate to dismiss as meaningless background traffic. Kubrick was not a director who let backgrounds take care of themselves. He was known for repeating takes until peripheral details aligned with the exact psychological effect he wanted. If two men and a child move through the last frame of his final film, it is reasonable to assume the movement was placed there intentionally. That does not automatically tell us what it means, but it does force a harder question. Why end there? Why place the daughter in motion while the parents remain still? Why let the film close not on reconciliation, but on a transfer occurring just outside conscious attention? The original script answers by turning to the Epstein case, where victim testimony and litigation documented a pattern of targeting minors, often through seemingly ordinary contact, softened by money, social legitimacy, and the appearance of opportunity. The strongest point is not symbolic, it is procedural. According to public records, many initial contacts were framed as harmless introductions: jobs, massages, travel, or access to a glamorous world. Parents were often absent from the first layer of reality, not because they did not care, but because the system was built to appear safe before it became coercive. This is where the toy store scene becomes difficult to shake, not because it proves a direct link to any one real case, but because it visualizes a mechanism: the child moving while the adults remain occupied, the transfer happening in plain sight, the danger concealed by normality rather than announced by force. The script then returns to the adult machinery surrounding that mechanism. In Epstein's world, prosecutors, civil litigators, reporters, estate representatives, and social intermediaries all appear across the public record. Not all served the same purpose, but together they formed a dense structure of delay, ambiguity, and controlled consequence. Eyes Wide Shut gives that structure a face. Victor Ziegler, he is calm, articulate, socially fluent, and never openly threatening. He does not silence Bill through force. He reorders Bill's understanding of what happened. That is why the billiard room matters. It shows containment achieved through narrative management. Ziegler's method is subtle. He offers partial truths, plausible dismissals, and just enough authority to make disbelief feel safer than recognition. The original script rightly emphasizes this. In systems like these, the stabilizing figure is often not the one who commits the act, but the one who makes the witness doubt the act occurred. That pattern appears repeatedly in the Epstein timeline. The 2007-2008 non-prosecution agreement, later ruled unlawful for failing to notify victims, did not erase allegations. It managed them. It converted a potentially devastating case into a contained one, with consequences that many observers saw as strikingly limited. Again, caution matters. Legal leniency is not identical to cinematic conspiracy, but the operational resemblance is what the original script is interested in. Systems that absorb exposure without fully collapsing. Systems that preserve their center by reframing, narrowing, settling, or delaying until public attention dissipates. The next comparison concerns layers. Epstein's public life included dinners, philanthropy, academic relationships, and social prestige. Many people around him have said they saw nothing criminal. Some may be telling the truth. That possibility does not weaken the model. It strengthens it. Outer innocence can serve inner concealment. Eyes Wide Shut is organized the same way. There is an outer ring that can be described, excused, even defended. Then there is another threshold. Bill reaches the first and fails at the second. In the original script, that missing second password becomes the structural key. Deeper access requires deeper compromise. That idea is not exotic. Closed systems routinely divide knowledge by function. Some participants provide legitimacy. Others handle operations. Others cross lines that bind them permanently. What the film captures with unusual clarity is the psychological architecture of that division, especially how confusion itself becomes part of the design. The script then reaches backward to Arthur Schnitzler, whose 1926 novella Dream Story became the source for Eyes Wide Shut. Schnitzler was not only a novelist, he was a physician trained in psychiatry and neurology, embedded in Viennese upper-class society and unusually close to its private contradictions. That biographical context matters, because it changes how the source text reads. Dream Story can be seen not merely as decadence imagined from a distance, but as encoded social knowledge, written by someone who understood the tension between respectable surface life and the hidden economies of desire beneath it. Kubrick appears to have recognized that immediately. He did not adapt Schnitzler as a literary ornament. He treated the material like recovered evidence, something that had survived because it had been disguised as fiction. That may be the deepest continuity in the whole story. Secrecy preserved through narrative form. The original script expands that point by placing Schnitzler inside a broader Viennese climate of psychoanalysis, occult revival, and elite sociability. Some of those historical circles overlapped, others merely coexisted. The important thing is not proving one hidden fraternity, but showing a milieu where secrecy, ritual, and class insulation could plausibly intersect. Kubrick then relocates that older structure into late 20th century power culture. New York wealth, private medicine, rented elegance, coded invitations, hired musicians, professional fixers. Nothing in the film requires medieval cloisters or ancient temples. The machinery is modern, upholstered, expensive, and careful never to call itself what it is. That is why the film continues to feel contemporary. It does not imagine evil as chaos. It imagines it as administration. Cars arrive on time, staff know their role. Doors open for the right people. Explanations are delivered calmly. Whatever the hidden center is, it survives because every visible layer appears ordinary enough. The original script's strongest claim is not that every symbol maps cleanly onto a documented real-world equivalent. It is that the operating logic does. Layered access, social camouflage, controlled geography, ritualized complicity, managed disbelief. A child moving unnoticed while the adults remain occupied. Those patterns recur too often to dismiss casually. From here, the story circles back to January 1999 and the private screening at Childwickbury Manor. We do not know exactly what was shown in that room. No complete public account exists, but the film that reached theaters was not identical to the one Kubrick had screened days before his death. That difference matters because removed material changes emphasis. Even when a plot remains intact, the deletion of a few specific images can alter what the audience is allowed to conclude. The original script suggests the most sensitive material was not the sexual content itself, but content that made identification easier. That remains unproven. Still, it is a reasonable line of inquiry. Ratings disputes usually concern explicitness, not recognizability. The distinction is important. One is about propriety. The other is about whether a fictional scene starts to resemble a document too closely for comfort among the people who might recognize it. The released version preserves enough to disturb, but not necessarily enough to orient. That may be why Eyes Wide Shut was filed away for years as a strange, overlong erotic mystery rather than treated as Kubrick's most pointed social investigation. The film survived in plain sight partly because most viewers lacked a framework for reading it. Then, years later, the Epstein case re-entered public consciousness with new force. Flight logs, victim depositions, civil filings, and renewed investigative work did not explain everything, far from it, but they made one thing harder to deny. Elite protection can coexist for years with visible warning signs and repeated allegations. Once those records became widely discussed, some viewers returned to Eyes Wide Shut and saw a different film. Not prophecy, not proof, a structure, a pattern they had previously watched without context. That is the shift the original script is built around, fiction becoming legible only after reality leaves paperwork behind. This is also why the toy store scene matters so much. It resists closure. Bill and Alice appear to have survived their brush with the hidden world. The marriage may continue, daily life resumes, yet the frame quietly implies that whatever system they touched has not finished its transaction. It simply continues elsewhere. In that reading, the entire film becomes less about adultery or jealousy than about selective vision. Who sees what? Who is allowed to understand? Who mistakes proximity for knowledge? Bill spends the film moving through surfaces, continually arriving just late enough and leaving just confused enough to remain manageable. That makes him useful as a viewer surrogate, but also as a warning. He is educated, affluent, socially mobile, and still almost entirely unequipped to process what he encounters. The original script uses that helplessness effectively. Elite systems do not survive because nobody notices them. They survive because notice is not the same as proof, and proof is not the same as consequence. Public records can surface, victims can testify, journalists can document patterns, yet closure remains elusive when institutions fragment responsibility across lawyers, intermediaries, silence, and time. Eyes Wide Shut understands that mechanism intimately. Its terror comes not from exposure, but from the failure of exposure to end anything. That is why the final image lands with such force once you see it. Not because it tells you everything, but because it tells you enough. The child is not centered. The act is not emphasized. The camera does not rescue anyone with interpretation. It leaves the burden of recognition entirely with the viewer. The original script calls this Kubrick's confession. That may go too far. A more careful conclusion would be this. He appears to have made a film about protected power that remains unnervingly compatible with later documented realities. Whether that compatibility came from research, intuition, proximity, or all three is still unresolved. Questions remain about the unseen cut, the removed footage, and the extent to which specific real-world networks informed the finished film. No official explanation resolves those questions fully, but unresolved does not mean irrelevant. Sometimes the most important pattern is not what can be conclusively proved, but what refuses to stop matching, so the film remains where Kubrick left it, half visible, half denied, easy to misread if approached as mere erotic dream logic, harder to dismiss if approached as a study of how power hides itself. The masks, the mansion, the music, the fixer, the child in the background, they all point in one direction, not toward certainty, toward structure. That is the distinction worth holding on to. A structure can be recognized before every name is known, before every record is unsealed, before every participant is identified. The film's enduring power lies in how clearly it stages a system that remains difficult to describe directly without sounding implausible. The house is one part of that structure. The ritual is another. The more important component is the invisible administration around them. Invitations, transportation, gatekeeping, deniability, and the careful separation between those who merely attend and those who understand what attendance really means. That separation appears again and again in real-world scandals in the original script. This is described as a two-layer architecture, an outer world full of prestige, conversation, and plausible innocence, an inner world governed by access, silence, and compromise. Whether one accepts every comparison or not, the model itself is persuasive because it reflects how protected institutions often operate. This also explains why exposure can fail. If the outer circle contains enough genuinely respectable people, then public scrutiny fractures. Some witnesses testify truthfully that they saw nothing criminal. Others know more but stay silent. Investigators encounter partial realities that do not line up cleanly, and the resulting confusion becomes a defense mechanism. Bill experiences exactly that confusion. He sees enough to feel endangered, but not enough to articulate a full case. He is warned, displaced, redirected, and finally spoken back into uncertainty by someone with higher social confidence than his own. The film does not show ignorance as absence. It shows ignorance as engineered incompletion. That may be the most modern thing about Eyes Wide Shut. Its central terror is informational, not supernatural. The threat is not only what powerful people do behind closed doors, it is the way they control the terms by which others are allowed to perceive those acts, remember them, and speak about them afterward. The original script uses Epstein as the clearest real-world echo of that logic. Again, the point is not to flatten every complexity into one grand design. It is to note documented patterns, recruitment through trust, insulation through wealth, delay through legal process, and reputational buffering through proximity to legitimate institutions. Those patterns help explain why so many people can orbit a scandal without sharing the same level of knowledge. Some encounter only the polished exterior. Some suspect more but never cross the threshold. Some cross it and become bound by fear, leverage, or self-interest. The resulting hierarchy of knowledge keeps the center protected. Kubrick visualizes that hierarchy with doors, passwords, costume, and performance, but he also visualizes it emotionally. Bill is always slightly misplaced, too late, too curious, too uncertain, too dependent on the reassurance of others. He is permitted to move through the edges of a system built precisely to prevent comprehension from becoming action. That is why Ziegler's warmth matters more than the ritual's menace. Hidden systems do not sustain themselves through spectacle alone. They survive through interpreters, People who can convert an alarming event into a manageable misunderstanding. They do not erase reality. They replace it with a version easier for institutions and witnesses to live with. The original script is especially strong when it treats Ziegler not as a villain in the ordinary sense, but as an operator of narrative containment. He is composed, credible, socially fluent, and selective with facts. He offers Bill a story that reduces risk by reducing significance. It is the perfect response to an unstable witness. If that dynamic feels familiar, it is because many public scandals end the same way, not with a dramatic revelation that reorders society, but with a blur of settlements, procedural narrowing, partial admissions, and fatigue. Enough truth emerges to disturb. Not enough consequence follows to convince anyone the system has actually been dismantled. This is where the missing material around Eyes Wide Shut keeps returning as an unresolved pressure point. We do not know what Kubrick's final screening version contained beyond what later reports and visible alterations imply, but even the existence of that gap changes how the finished film is experienced. Something is absent, and the film knows it. That absence becomes part of the atmosphere. The released cut often feels like a record with key passages muted, not incomprehensible, but fractionally displaced from full clarity. The original script interprets that displacement as evidence of suppression. A more cautious reading would say it functions, at minimum, like a wound in the narrative surface. And wounds invite comparison. Once viewers learned more about elite protection networks through later reporting and court records, details in Eyes Wide Shut no longer felt merely stylized. The hidden estate, the ceremonial distance, the social shields, the managed explanation, the unnoticed child. Each began to resemble something less like fantasy and more like compression. Compression is the right word because great films often condense systems into images. A mansion can stand in for a class structure. A password can stand in for graduated access. A masked circle can stand in for ritualized complicity. A child moving out of frame can stand in for the true cost hidden beneath adult narratives. That is why the film still produces unease without offering resolution. It does not close the case. It leaves the case structurally open. The people closest to danger survive with only fragments of understanding. The institutions around them keep functioning. The visible world remains intact enough to continue, which may be the most disturbing outcome of all. So when the original script says the film was read differently after public records emerged, it is describing a genuine shift in context. Context does not create evidence retroactively, but it can change what an old work makes visible. The audience changed. And once the audience changed, the film's signal started landing differently. That does not mean every interpretation is equally sound. Some claims go beyond what the public record supports. The stronger approach is narrower and, for that reason, harder to dismiss. Eyes Wide Shut appears to understand the choreography of protected power with unusual precision. Even where its exact reference remain uncertain, the choreography matters because power is rarely visible at the moment it becomes most consequential. It appears first as etiquette, architecture, invitation, and tone. By the time the underlying reality becomes legible, the witness is already out of position. The records are dispersed, and the event has been translated into something socially safer. Kubrick's camera mirrors that condition. He does not explain the hidden world into clarity. He lets viewers feel the limitations of partial access. Bill is always close enough to sense design, never close enough to master it. That formal choice gives the film its documentary chill without ever pretending to be literal journalism. It also explains why the movie was easy to underestimate on first release. Audiences expected provocation, erotic scandal, or celebrity intrigue. What they received was a study in controlled perception. Without the later context of public scandal, the film's deeper pattern could be mistaken for abstraction, mannerism, or one final exercise in Kubrickian ambiguity. But ambiguity is not the same thing as emptiness. In this case, ambiguity functions like a protective casing. It allows the film to circulate while withholding stable conclusions. The original script treats that as strategic encoding. Whether deliberate or incidental, the effect is the same. The film survives because it can still be denied. Denial is one of the central subjects here. Not simple disbelief, but managed denial, socially useful denial, professionally useful denial, denial supported by partial truths and plausible alibis. Hidden systems do not need everyone to lie. They only need enough people to know a little, suspect a little, and stop one step too early. That is why the respectable surface matters so much in both the film and the real-world comparisons that shadow it. A dinner party, a donor, an academic salon, a prestigious address, a gracious host. These are not decorative details. They are operational shields. They make scrutiny appear impolite until it becomes too late. The original script frames this as camouflage, and that is accurate. But camouflage alone is too passive a word. What we are looking at is active legitimacy, a public layer that does real work, attracts sincere participants, and produces authentic social proof. The outer ring is not fake, it is functional. That functional outer ring helps explain a recurring puzzle in major scandals. How so many intelligent, connected people can appear nearby without speaking clearly, either because they truly did not see the center or because what they saw never stabilized into something they felt able to name. Proximity does not automatically produce comprehension. Eyes Wide Shut dramatizes this mercilessly. Bill has class access, education, mobility, and still remains structurally naive. He can enter rooms, but not read them. He can witness fragments, but not assemble them in time. In that sense, the film is not only about hidden elites, it is about the helplessness of partial knowledge. The toy store ending returns here with even greater force. The scene suggests that the most consequential movement in the frame is the one no character acknowledges. Adult conversation continues. Marital tension is being resolved. The family appears intact, and yet the eye is invited, almost too late, to notice another story proceeding behind them. That compositional choice reframes the entire film. The question is no longer simply what Bill saw at the mansion. It becomes what Bill failed to see everywhere else, especially in the ordinary spaces where trust and distraction coexist. The hidden world does not stay hidden by remaining distant. It survives by appearing adjacent to normal life. This is where the original script's comparison to documented recruitment patterns becomes most unsettling. Many abusive systems do not begin with overt coercion. They begin with familiarity, permission, aspiration, and the suspension of alarm. The danger is not always the dark room. Sometimes it is the well-lit store where no one thinks to look twice. That insight is one reason the film continues to haunt people who revisit it later in life. The first viewing often follows Bill into the mystery. Later viewings start to watch the margins instead. Who is standing where? Who appears to know whom? Who moves without drawing notice? And what the frame quietly refuses to explain. Kubrick trusted viewers enough to let those questions arrive late. He did not underline every implication because underlining would have reduced the realism of the experience. In actual systems of concealed power, revelation rarely arrives with clean emphasis. It arrives belatedly, through pattern recognition, after the moment when intervention would have been easiest. That is also why later public records matter. Even if they do not answer every question raised by the film, they supply a grammar. They show how recruitment can hide behind prestige, how legal structures can soften exposure, how institutions can remain adjacent without collapsing, and how victims can be obscured by the very world around them. Once that grammar exists, Eyes Wide Shut becomes harder to wave away as pure dream logic. It still operates as fiction. It still withholds certainty. But fiction can preserve recognizable structures long before the culture is ready to name them openly. Sometimes a story survives because it tells the truth sideways. And that may be the most disciplined way to approach this film now, not as solved, not as prophecy, not as a code that unlocks every hidden network, but as a carefully made object that appears to have absorbed too much of reality to remain comfortably dismissed. That discomfort is the point. The original script closes by returning to the screening room, and that is the right instinct. Not because the room gives us answers, but because it concentrates the uncertainty. A completed film was shown. A director died days later. The released version was altered. The unseen version remains inaccessible. The sequence still resists easy dismissal. Nothing in that sequence, by itself, establishes foul play. That needs to be said plainly. But the combination of timing, subject matter, and posthumous modification has kept the case alive in public imagination for a reason. Some events remain unresolved not because evidence is abundant, but because the pattern never settles. The original script suggests the most sensitive material may have been whatever linked elite adult transgression more explicitly to the exploitation of children. That cannot be verified from public evidence alone. Still, when viewers revisit what remains in the theatrical cut, the anxiety seems to gather precisely around that missing connection. The adult ritual content survived, though obscured. Ziegler's explanatory monologue survived almost intact. The party culture, the secrecy, the humiliation, the threat, all of that remained viewable. What feels partially absent is the bridge between those adult mechanisms and the quieter implication carried by Helena in the final scene. That gap matters because systems of abuse are rarely organized around spectacle for its own sake. Spectacle can be a lure, a bond, a pressure device, or a loyalty test. But beneath the theater there is usually a more practical center: access, leverage, acquisition, and the conversion of human vulnerability into protected advantage. In the public record surrounding Epstein, That practical center is not ambiguous. Prosecutors, victims, and civil litigants documented the exploitation of underage girls as foundational, not incidental. The glamour around the network did not contradict that function. It protected it, normalized it, and helped make it harder to challenge early. Eyes Wide Shut never states such a center directly. It is too careful for that. Instead, it leaves traces, a secret world organized by class insulation. A witness talked back into uncertainty, a family scene that does not feel safe once the background is noticed. The original script is strongest when it lets those traces accumulate. Accumulation is how the film works. One detail is deniable. 2 details are intriguing. 10 details begin to form a pattern. A Rothschild estate, masked ceremony, reversed liturgical sound, managed access, a socially fluent fixer, a child leaving the frame unnoticed. None of these proves a thesis alone. Together, they refuse to relax. That refusal is part of Kubrick's method. He often built meaning through repetition, spatial dislocation, and the deliberate mismatch between what characters think is happening and what the audience slowly realizes may be happening elsewhere. Eyes Wide Shut applies that method not to war or madness, but to social concealment. This is why the film feels colder than a conventional thriller. There is no cathartic exposure, no triumphant confrontation, no system visibly brought down. Bill does not decode the hidden world. He survives contact with it and remains fundamentally unable to name it. Survival, in this story, is not the same as understanding. The original script reads that limitation as intentional and ethically important. If Kubrick believed some structures could only be shown indirectly, then a film that leaves its protagonist confused may actually be more truthful than one that resolves the mystery. Confusion in hidden systems is not a flaw of perception. It is part of the design. That returns us to the central discipline of this entire investigation, not overstating what cannot be proven. Some reports suggest intelligence overlaps, ritual symbolism, or deeper continuity among elite circles. Some claims go much further than the evidence supports. The stronger argument remains the narrower one. The documented structure is already disturbing enough. Wealth created private space. Prestige softened suspicion. Social legitimacy attracted credible witnesses who saw nothing criminal. Legal process slowed exposure. Professional intermediaries translated danger into ambiguity. Victims struggled against a system larger than any single perpetrator. None of that requires speculative embellishment. It is already visible in the public record. That is what gives Eyes Wide Shut its continuing force. The film does not need to predict every later revelation to feel precise. It only needs to understand, with unusual clarity, how secrecy and power cooperate, how the outer world creates cover, how the inner world creates compromise, and how both depend on selective attention. The toy store remains the final test of attention. If you do not see the background movement, the ending feels unresolved but survivable. If you do see it, the film curdles. Domestic repair becomes a decoy. Adult closure becomes suspect. The entire narrative pivots from marital psychology to inherited vulnerability in a matter of seconds. That pivot is the reason the ending lingers. It suggests that the true danger of elite systems is not confined to the rooms where they performed themselves. The deeper danger is transmission. What moves quietly from hidden chambers into ordinary life, into family space, into places so familiar they no longer trigger alarm. So the film remains open, and perhaps it has to. The unseen cut is still unseen. The dead cannot clarify their intentions. Real-world records continue to surface unevenly, often years late and never in perfect form. What remains available to us is pattern recognition, disciplined comparison, and the willingness to look again at what was dismissed too quickly. That is not the same as certainty. It is something less complete and, in some ways, more demanding. It requires holding unresolved facts without flattening them into fantasy or surrendering them to forgetfulness. It requires admitting where evidence ends while still noticing when separate records appear to echo the same hidden architecture. In that sense, Eyes Wide Shut may be best understood not as a solved message, but as a surviving document of unease. A film that seems to know more than it can safely say outright, and that becomes clearer only after reality produces enough paperwork to teach the audience how to read it. And perhaps that is where this investigation should end. Not with a declaration, but with a frame. A mansion built for power, a ritual staged with impossible calm, a witness redirected by a man who specializes in explanation. A child moving unnoticed in the background, a film altered after its maker was gone. The rest remains unresolved. If this video changed the way you see the story, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps this channel reach more people who are ready to look deeper. Leave your thoughts in the comments and tell us what case we should investigate next. This is Shadow Archive. Stay alert and question everything.